Hello, Boost Conference. I'm Anita Walker, Executive Director of the Mass Cultural Council, with my colleague, Erik Holmgren. And first, we have to tell you, we really wish we were there with you in Palm Springs, but here we are in Boston, and we thought we'd join you by way of technology. We love to talk about creative youth development, don't we, Erik?
We do.
And it's this kind of a special day for us because actually it's the 5-year anniversary of when creative youth development was born and got a name and became part of a national movement. Now, we've been doing creative youth development without the name for what, more than 25 years?
At least 25.
Talk more about that.
Sure. So back in 1994, in response to an NEA grant, the Mass Cultural Council started a grant program called Youth Reach. And at that time, the program supported artists who were doing work with young people. They were people who were trying to solve problems locally. Zoomix in East Boston was founded by Madeline Stasinski in response to violence. Abe Rybeck founded the Theater Offensive, which was dealing with the AIDS epidemic in Boston in the late 80s and early 90s. As those artists sort of grew, they grew into a group of organizations, and then those organizations eventually became a field. And to celebrate the 20th anniversary of Youth Reach, we had a big party, and we invited all of them together with national colleagues, with the National Guild, President's Committee on the Arts and Humanities, which existed back then. That's another conversation. And we had a summit to talk about how to move this work forward, and 3 things happened in that summit. First, we named the work Creative Youth Development for the very first time. We just called it This Work before that time. Second is we created a policy and advocacy agenda for how to move the work forward. And third, and probably most importantly, it was this real catalytic we moment where all of these people came together for the first time and looked at one another and saw people doing the same kind of work and shared in that struggle together. So at the end of that summit, everyone made a pledge of what they were going to do for creative youth development. And we've seen amazing things happen with those pledges in the last 5 years, including here at Mass Cultural Council with Anita fulfilling her pledge.
Which was to increase funding, I think I said times 10. And I think we
you
did.
said times 2 and we did 3.
Oh, okay. Well, nevertheless, we're up to 1.8
million per year.
8 million per year funding creative youth development. Funding, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but let's talk about what creative youth development is before we get to that point. So the summit was really a way for us to not only look at the research which defined creative youth development, but to see ourselves as a field of practice. And I think that's really important, to be part of a community and a field of practice. Not only does it extend learning and networking, but it also kind of guarantees quality. We're keeping each other to high standards, especially when we're serving vulnerable youth and vulnerable teens. So I like to kind of tick off a few of what I call the characteristics of creative youth development because generally they're easy for me to remember, except I usually forget one. Let's see how I do. So what is creative youth development? Well, first of all, it provides a safe place for young people to be. Many of the youth in our programs are coming out of violent homes, hostile neighborhoods, surrounded by gangs, drug addiction, or maybe even put on the curb because they have a disagreement with their parents about their sexual identification. So giving people a safe place to be and something meaningful to do to that space is really one of the first elements or characteristics of creative youth development. The other things our programs do is they provide relationships, caring relationships with adults, but also positive relationships with colleagues and peers. They offer young people a chance to use their voice. These aren't programs that are about fixing broken kids. We call them asset-based. These are programs where we really harness the potential and innate agency of young people so that they can make a difference in their own lives and they can craft a path for their own future. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in the conversation when we had the summit 5 years ago is that there was a lot of discussion and some disagreement about the use of these 2 words, social justice. Some people thought that those were maybe a little more radioactive kinds of words, but at the end of the day, all more than 200 plus people who came from 25 states to have a conversation around creative youth development agreed that one of the distinguishing features of these programs is that they sit on a platform of social justice. They're not only about making meanings in the lives of our young people, but it's engaging young people to make meaning in their communities, and it's a critical part of these programs. The other part is that they're not just drop-offs, they're not just drive-bys, they're intensive programs that have daily interactions between the youth and their mentors and the artists that they work with, and they also are rigorous. These aren't just macaroni on a paper plate, just arts activity. Kids Plus Art does not equal creative youth development. These programs are really intensive, disciplined, rigorous programs that focus on excellence in the arts.
I think a lot of these criteria are things you'll find in other youth development fields, clearly. I think what's happened in the arts is that there's this blurry line sometimes between research and advocacy, the things we believe the arts can do for young people and the outcomes that we actually achieve. So we talk about creative youth development as really bridging this gap between hope and how in art making. So instead of hoping that playing in an orchestra or creating art will have a positive impact, it infuses these principles of youth development. And that was a real challenge in Massachusetts initially, because it was small community-based organizations who were the one who had to do all of the learning and put those two fields together and find colleagues and find partnerships that didn't really exist in the artistic ecosystem in Massachusetts. At this point, those organizations have come together and developed tools and developed ideas and developed practices that have been implemented and been effective. And what we're seeing now in Massachusetts are large institutions who are trying to engage with these principles and go through this sort of process of institutional learning, which is messy and takes forever, but all of a sudden the teachers for that are these community-based nonprofits, and that's a real change over 25 years here in Massachusetts.
We've seen the impact of our creative youth development programs on the young people in them. So now we're trying to figure out, what do we need to do? How can we lead as a state agency? How can we lead as a community to make sure that these programs are available to all youth who could benefit from them? So that has us looking at a couple of the pipeline pieces that go into a creative youth development program and come out of a creative youth development program. On the input side, our people who are working, our practitioners who are working in creative youth development programs, they deserve to have professional development. They deserve to be able to get together as a community and learn together and network together. So to that end, we have started, the last 3 or 4 years with a program that really focuses on teaching artists.
There's a big gap that we identified between higher ed preparation and the realities of community-based work. So in Massachusetts and Boston specifically, we have colleges and universities about every 10 steps out the window. There's no credentialed music education program in the United States that teaches youth development. It's something that has to be learned on the ground. So we created this fellowship for in-school and out-of-school time creative youth development organizations. It doesn't matter what time they make art, we just care that they do. And we started focusing on youth worker training and bringing in people like Bettina Love, who everyone should go hear Bettina Love. She will illuminate your world. And focusing on the kinds of challenges that are in place in these communities rather than the credential-based programs before. The feedback has been tremendous. We pay everyone for their time. We make sure they all have access to grants of up to $3,000 for things that matter to them as they know best in that space. But it's a critical area here where these are the people who are always delivering these services, and we need alignment between the people who are in the room, people who are just outside the room, and the people that are farther away and funders, and I think we're getting there.
Now, of course, we are a state agency, and we have certain bureaucratic elements like we require final reports from all the programs that we fund. We fund about 70 creative youth development programs here in Massachusetts. But we learn a lot from those final reports. And one of the things that stood out in high relief as we've been looking at them over the last couple of years is the increase in the need for help in addressing the trauma that these young people carry when they come into our programs. So now we're looking at some professional development in trauma-informed work.
Every year in those final reports, it seems to be growing. Social isolation and trauma-informed practice in these programs becomes an essential piece of it. And again, it's not being taught anywhere else. And so, young people and teaching artists and organizations have to learn out on their own, and we need to sort of step into that systemic space so that young people have what they need because they're at these programs by choice.
So now let's get back to that favorite word of all, money. How do we pay for all this? Well, we've been really fortunate in Massachusetts that through great advocacy, we've been able to increase our budget at the Mass Cultural Council. And since creative youth development is core to our work, we've been able to increase funding for that. That's the good news here in Massachusetts. Here's the bad news, and I'm not proud to tell you this. we are not finding a lot of allies in the funding community. In fact, some of the major foundations that do fund arts at all are more interested these days in creative economy or creative placemaking. And what used to be core to the work of most arts funders, youth arts, seems to have fallen off the portfolio in a lot of these cases. So we find ourselves to be one of the only funders in Massachusetts of creative youth development, even in the midst of some of the best work that we think is happening anywhere in the country. So if there are any funders in the audience out there, and I'm led to believe that there might be one or two, please take a look at this. We fund creative youth development along with creative placemaking, along with individual artists, along with communities, along with local cultural councils, along with festivals, along with teaching artists in the schools. The list goes on, but I can tell you that the most transformational work that's happening is in creative youth development. We think this is some of the most important work happening in the arts and culture anywhere on the planet, because it is truly making a meaningful and a big difference in the lives of the young people who participate in our programs. So why can't that be available to early childhood? And why can't that be available to adults? And why can't that be available to senior citizens? Creative youth development is really creative human development. There is a huge landscape and horizon that we could be addressing with our teaching artists and with the fundamental principles of creative youth development.
For some reason, we found that the needs of young people are not changing, the priorities of funders are. And I think in that is this challenge that we're talking about, but there's also an opportunity because young people don't have sectors. We sort of put them in those sectors, and there's different accountabilities, and we pull in different directions sometimes. But the outcomes of creative youth development are not about the arts, they're about young people. And so I think it's an opportunity for the field to really start to look at those other sectors as potential funding sources and potential partners. And as we move forward, as you see on stage, we have colleagues in this work. In San Diego, some of the most groundbreaking work in the United States is happening at a local level. Here in Massachusetts, we just described what we're doing here, and we're pretty enthusiastic about it. And in the national level, the National Guild is leading with a national blueprint for creative youth development, which gives a variety of different tools and strategies for how this might grow, and how local communities might be able to implement some of the practices from other places. The Guild also acts as a convener each year at their conference for conversations about this because it looks so different in different communities. There's different funders, there's different major cultural organizations, there's different social services, there's different populations. So everybody needs to craft something that is uniquely theirs, but the needs will always be there. And the arts, going back to the first conservatories of music in Italy in the 1500s being built in orphanages, the arts have always had this social purpose. We're dedicated here in Massachusetts to driving it forward.
That's why we believe in the power of culture. We wish we could be with you in Palm Beach. I bet the sun is shining. We have a little bit of sun here, but it's supposed to rain here the rest of the week. But I know you're going to have a fantastic conversation. Wish we could be part of it. But we're here, so if you want to reach out to Erik or myself, please go to the website, Mass Cultural Council. You can find us online, and I'm sure other people there have our contact information. Have a great conference. Wish we could be part of it.